Dear friends, tonight we are greatly honored by the presence of two individuals who take very seriously our obligation to tikkun olam, to repairing a world that at times feels almost hopelessly broken. Since October 7th, we've become absorbed, understandably, by developments in Israel and with the hostages. So much so that the war in Ukraine and the struggles of the Ukrainian people have almost been eclipsed in our consciousness. But even with our focus on Israel, we cannot forget Ukraine. There too, Jewish and American values are at stake. So tonight, we're proud to welcome Liev Schreiber and Michael Goldfarb to remind us of that. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mr. Schreiber, a 5-time Golden Globe, 3-time Emmy-nominated and Tony-winning actor, director, and writer, watched the televised horrors and felt the need to do something. Of Ukrainian heritage himself, Liev has long supported cross-cultural ties through his work, most notably in his directorial debut, Everything is Illuminated, which follows a young Jewish American to Western Ukraine to find the woman who saved his grandfather during the Holocaust. So in response to the Russian aggression, Mr. Schreiber developed the idea for BlueCheck Ukraine and co-founded the organization with Michael Goldfarb. We were introduced to BlueCheck by the former chair of our philanthropic committee, John Sorkin. We heard from another of its co-founders on Yom Kippur afternoon, and we proudly support it. BlueCheck Ukraine identifies, vets, and fast-tracks urgent financial support to Ukrainian NGOs and aid initiatives providing life-saving and other critical humanitarian work on the front lines of the war, where civilians remain trapped by the fighting. But Mr. Schreiber wanted to do more. So he not only went to Ukraine, but spent a month in Poland slicing vegetables for vats of borscht and roasting literally a ton of brisket to feed Ukrainians fleeing the war. Then he posted on Instagram the call of the Passover Seder he learned from his Ukrainian grandfather: "Let all who are hungry come and eat." Tonight, he joins us to speak about that work and about the evolution of his Jewish and American identity and the values that define it. He will then return at the conclusion of services, joined by Michael Goldfarb, his co-founder of BlueCheck, for a conversation about Ukraine, BlueCheck, and the work they hold dear. But now please welcome Liev Schreiber.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi Davidson. That was a really exceptional introduction. I hope I maybe can borrow that sometime. And thank you, Gotti, Temple Emanu-El, and the Stryker Cultural Center. And thank you all for being here this evening and for inviting me to your Shabbat services. There is a misconception out there in the ethos that actors are generally good at public speaking. Having spent the majority of my life working as a professional actor and the past 18 months risking the perils of public speaking, I now know that nothing could be further from the truth, and that there is absolutely no correlation between my innate ability to portray violent and emotionally disturbed characters and the possibility that given a microphone, I might deliver anything substantive, compelling, or even remotely coherent. Bearing that in mind, I've scribbled down some notes to share with all of you tonight about my own Jewish American identity and how perhaps it has shifted somewhat over the past 2 years. I say my Jewish American identity because for me, it's hard to imagine those two words existing independent of each other. It's like chocolate and peanut butter. They're both great on their own, but put them together and, well, you know. Over the past 35 years, I have had the great good fortune to be gainfully employed in a career that has continually allowed me to experiment and explore the constructs of identity and heritage. And anyone who knows me will tell you that everything I am, every role I've ever played, every script I've ever written, was in one way or another an extension of my desire to know and be known by my grandfather. His name was Alex Milgram, and to be honest, it was never entirely clear where he had come from. One version had him coming to America as a young boy from Łódź in Poland. Another had him leaving from a small village in southern Ukraine called Tomaszpil, not far from Odessa. Part of the reason for this mystery around my grandfather's origins is that once he arrived in America, he never spoke about being from anywhere else. Over time, I began to notice that this was something of a pattern for many Eastern European Jews of that generation. Something about their past, whether it was the pogroms or World War II, had caused them to leave their homes and risk their lives coming to America so that their children and their children's children might one day have the opportunity to stand in a place like this and speak to a group like you. To me, that is the promise of our democracy, and so much of what it means to be American. A nation of grandchildren. I doubt there are many people in this room whose grandparents or great-grandparents didn't come from somewhere else, who didn't push a cart somewhere selling buttons and zippers so that their children could have a shot at something they never did. The inalienable right to self-determination, a system of values and governance that still make us the #1 destination in the world for anyone looking to improve their station in life. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what makes us great. That's what defines us as Americans. That's what motivated Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, two Jewish boys from New York, who drove down to Mississippi in 1964 and gave their lives in the fight to end segregation. Those are American values. That's the potential of our democracy, to believe in each other and the power of our union. And that's exactly what the people of Ukraine are fighting for today. The right to choose their own leaders, to speak their own language, to raise their children to believe in their inalienable right to exist as Ukrainians. It seems unthinkable that something as horrific as Hitler's attempt to eradicate an entire culture and its people could ever happen again in our lifetime. But Putin's cynical strategy of shelling innocent civilians, stealing their children, and banning Ukrainian language, literature, and culture from Russian discourse has a foreboding familiarity. And yet somehow we find Israel sitting on the dock in The Hague and not Russia. Now for the Jewish part. Growing up in a Puerto Rican neighborhood on the Lower East Side of New York, I can't say I really related that much to being Jewish. My mother did her best. I remember her telling me that Jews were the chosen people. Like every other Jewish mother, she had a list of luminaries she would pull from. Albert Einstein, Sandy Koufax, Yasha Heifetz, Carole King, to try and convince me that Jews were the best at everything. The fact that we were on welfare and living in a squat without any hot water or electricity didn't make me feel particularly chosen. And judging from my report cards, it seemed highly unlikely that I was ever going to be the best at anything. To make matters worse, my grandfather, my role model, Alex, wasn't exactly a shining example of Jewish world dominance either. He delivered meat to diners. He wasn't particularly observant, wouldn't speak Hebrew or Yiddish, and worst of all, he loved hockey. In fact, with his clothes on, the only thing that really gave him away was that he played the cello and hated everything German. On a side note, years later, when my older brother married a German woman, my grandfather pulled a complete 180 and started buying Heineken as a symbol of his newfound appreciation for German culture. I never actually had the heart to tell him that Heineken was Dutch. But every spring, my grandfather would have a Passover Seder, and my entire fractious family would gather in his tiny apartment on Washington Place and become impossibly drunk as we reminded ourselves of the bittersweet flavor of being Jewish. I remember my brothers and I fighting over the Afikomen and poking each other with forks as the grown-ups argued over the Haggadah and which passages were most important to read. I always loved that the whole thing kicked off with an argument, a rabbinical debate about what day creation actually occurred. And then the questions asked by a child. I know it sounds contrary, but that's probably what I love most about being Jewish. That questions and debate are at the heart of Jewish thinking, as if truth and its constant need for calibration were a matter of life and death. Because it is. Unfortunately, that is the deeply polarized and protean world we live in today. A world in which speaking louder or speaking first is valued more than speaking truth. A world where misinformation and disinformation separate us so profoundly from rational thinking that the opinion of a celebrity and the size of their social media following is somehow as worthy of our attention as the actions of a 22-year-old medic in southern Israel who throws her body into the line of fire to protect the people she loves. Or for that matter, a Palestinian doctor who refuses to abandon his hospital and the patients he cares for. A world in which algorithms, designed to categorize and divide us for the purposes of marketing, have separated us so completely from any true sense of ourselves that we have forgotten who we are, where we've come from, and perhaps most importantly, the shared values and moral imperatives that by design should bind us together. Tomorrow, this congregation will read a Torah portion that lays out the institution of Passover. It describes our last days in Egypt, the final 3 plagues, and Moses' leadership as he prepares the Jews for Exodus. Curiously, Moses doesn't spend a lot of time talking about freedom, the logistics of leaving Egypt, or even the final destination. As the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks observed, on the eve of the Exodus, Moses talks about identity, children, education, and the importance of storytelling to our survival as a people. Rabbi Sacks wrote the following: Moses wanted us to give our children an identity by turning history into memory and memory itself into a sense of responsibility. Because those who forget the bitterness of slavery eventually lose the commitment and courage to fight for freedom. I couldn't think of a clearer call to action or a better reason to support our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. For me, BlueCheck Ukraine is not only a product of my Jewish American identity, it is a debt I owe to my grandparents and the blood that generation shed for me, to my country and the opportunities it has provided me, and to the future of my children and my children's children who will hopefully continue to exercise their inalienable right to exist. I hope you'll join Michael Goldfarb and I as we continue this conversation after the service and take some of your questions about BlueCheck and Ukraine as well. Thank you, Rabbi.